Good evening, everyone. I'm Director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for another Morton-Kenney lecture. This is an important lecture series that the Institute co-hosts with the Political Science Department, and we've had some really legendary speakers. James Baker has been here, George McGovern, Ted Sorensen, we've had Professor David Kennedy. So really distinguished group, and we think our speaker tonight is definitely in that same league. I should say just a word about the lectureship that was established by Jerry Moore, well known here, of course, who in 1995 created this in honor of his two favorite political science professors, Morton and David Kennedy. And it's been an important lecture series that the Institute has had for more than 2 decades. So tonight's speaker, Elizabeth Hinton, is one of the rock stars in the academic world. She is a widely respected professor at Yale in both the law and African American studies programs. She's one of the country's leading experts on poverty, racial inequality, urban unrest, and criminal justice reform. Elizabeth grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, has an undergraduate degree from NYU, and master's and doctorate from Columbia. She's taught at the University of Michigan, at Harvard, and now is at Yale. She's the author of 2 really important books. Her first book is called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. And her most recent book, which came out about a year and a half ago, is called America on Fire, The Untold Story of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. As you'll see in just a few minutes, Elizabeth combines both rigorous scholarship with a really warm and engaging speaking style. I've heard that the longest line at Yale is to get into one of Elizabeth's classes, so she is just deeply respected by faculty and students. And I will say, just finally, before I introduce her, we have a Zoom series called Understanding Our New World, and Elizabeth was one of our guests in actually March of 2021, and was just terrific, easy to talk to, wonderfully engaging. And shortly after I got off the conference call, I received an email from someone who said, thank you so much for inviting such an astounding scholar to our community. So we thought we'd actually do it in person rather than virtually. And another sent a note which said, one of the finest interviews and talks ever. I'm ordering Elizabeth Hinton's book and rethinking the world as it should be. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Hinton.
So much for that all too generous introduction. Now I actually have to live up to that, so hopefully I'll do it. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak, to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute for hosting, to Carol Greenlee for making sure that all the logistics from my flights and this PowerPoint were up and smooth, and of course all of you for coming. I am deeply, deeply honored to have the opportunity to deliver the esteemed Morton-Kenney Public Affairs lecture here in Carbondale. And this is my first time here, but Southeast Illinois, and especially Cairo, about 50 miles south, as many of you know, has really been on my mind for the past few years as I researched and wrote America on Fire. The book was released, as John mentioned, exactly 1 year after the murder of George Floyd and the nationwide movement for racial justice sparked by his death. Millions of mostly young people defiantly flooded into the nation's streets, demanding an end to police brutality and to the broader systemic oppression of Black people and other people of color, in what is perhaps the largest mass mobilization in American history. And to many observers, the protests appeared to be without precedent in their scale and persistence. Yet the events of 2020 had clear precursors, and any attempt to understand our current crisis requires a reckoning with our recent past. Between 1964 and 1972, the United States confronted the greatest moment of domestic During these 8 years, at least 1,000 segregated Black communities across the United States witnessed roughly 2,500 separate uprisings. Big cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Detroit burned. But the violence could happen in any place where Black residents were denied access to political and economic resources and lived in segregated, unequal conditions. The so-called riots were a fact of life in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And here in Carbondale, Black residents erupted exactly 1 month after Martin Luther King Jr. died, and then again in September '69, May 1970, and November 1971. The incidents in Carbondale and elsewhere were born in response to poverty and exclusion, but most immediately in reaction to police violence. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson had launched the War on Crime, sending militarized police forces into impoverished Black neighborhoods. Facing increased surveillance and brutality, residents threw Molotov cocktails at officers and rocks. They plundered local businesses, and they vandalized exploitative institutions. But rather than rioting as something meaningless or irrational, devoid of any political motivation and ultimately criminal, we should understand these events as rebellions, as explosions of collective resistance to an unequal, unjust, and violent order. As the Reverend Charles Cohen, a prominent Cairo-based activist who preached the politics of armed self-defense and community control, pointed out, quote, voting rights could not be eaten or made into clothing and shelter. Although the rebellions emerged in response to a moment of tangibly felt racism, most often police encounter, participants sought concessions from authorities in the areas of employment, housing, education, and law enforcement, and a reordering of the status quo so that Black people would no longer be treated as second-class citizens in their city and in the country. And these were the same goals as the civil rights movement more broadly. As Cohen and the rising generation saw it, the sit-ins, marches, boycotts, voter registration drives, and legal challenges that defined Black politics in the post-war period had not addressed structural inequalities or provided protection from the lived realities of police and white supremacist violence. Having exhausted all the other options, rebellion, which was the most widely adopted form of protest among young Black people from King's assassination into the early 1970s, served as a message to the nation that civil rights reform, an unprecedented war on poverty, and nonviolent direct action tactics were inadequate to solve the problem of racial inequality. Unlike many other cities that erupted in the era of rebellion, the violence in Cairo did not fizzle out, and it was not put down. On the contrary, it would continue on and off again for years, from 1967 until the spring of 1972. And this was because in Cairo, white supremacist organizations were highly organized, heavily armed, and actively collaborated with local law enforcement. And as a result, violence was protracted and particularly deadly. And many of you know this story and have even lived through it. And I'm not going to be able to capture the complexity of what happened in the short time that I have with you, but I want to use this opportunity to reflect on this history together. Because over the course of the time that I was researching and writing America on Fire, what happened in Cairo, and a particular scene from Cairo, really haunted me. This scene took place on the last day of March 31st, 1969, and a group of white men were standing on top of the Mississippi River levee in Cairo, 60 feet in the air, with guns in their hands. A rail yard, that you can kind of see in the space there, sat between the levee and Pyramid Courts, which was the city's segregated Black housing project. That evening, a train crew happened to be milling about. And these men sitting on the levee had a panoramic view of the entire community, which was home to roughly half of the city's Black residents, with about 2,000 people living in it. Located on the fringes of Cairo, Pyramid Courts had been built in an area that was vulnerable to flooding on the exact spot where formerly enslaved people were kept in a contraband camp under the Union Army's watch. Its construction and that of the other white housing project in Cairo, Alamo Place, began in 1939 when the Federal Housing Authority broke ground on public housing across the country as part of the New Deal. The white elites who controlled the Cairo Housing Authority intended the two projects to be wholly segregated but courtesy of the city's housing authority did not extend to its black tenants in pyramid courts. By the time the white men started shooting into pyramid courts from the levy in 1969, the apartments in the housing project were decaying. Plumbing failed, ceilings cracked, and roaches and rats proliferated. Tenants had to pay for all of the repairs with their own money, and families unknowingly drank water contaminated with lead. Conditions in Elmwood Place were only slightly better, but its white residents didn't have to worry about getting shot while they went about their lives. Many black and white Cairo residents could not even secure an apartment in deteriorating public housing. Because since 1960, only 9 new houses were built in the city and 200 were torn down, leaving 45.8% of all residents in Cairo in deteriorating homes. During the 1960s and 70s, Cairo consistently ranked first among the Illinois cities in proportion of residents living in poverty, second in the number of people living in substandard housing, and third in its levels of unemployment. When the shooting began around 10 o'clock on March 31st, 1969, the residents in pyramid courts reached for their own guns. Some rushed outside to shoot out the dozen or so streetlights in the project to prevent themselves from being illuminated to their attackers. Police arrived, and then more shots were fired, with the exchange lasting between 1 and 3 hours. Cairo Police Chief Charles Klutz insisted that pyramid courts residents had started the entire affair by firing at the railroad between the project and the leaving. And a witness corroborated this official story, claiming that he, quote, saw a group of Negroes with a bunch of guns about 15 minutes before the shooting began. None of the white perpetrators were arrested, but a 25-year-old black man named Jerry Parrott did get taken into custody that night after he reportedly ignored police orders to halt when he was caught with a rifle under his coat. The shot-out streetlights in pyramid courts went unfixed, and the housing project remained completely dark at night for years. Residents would turn off lamps in their apartments when the sun went down, or they would board up their windows. Children, the ones in this image, would do homework in the darkness, and sometimes they would sleep with their parents in bathtubs where they were less likely to be hit by a bullet from the outside forces. On nights when it seemed safe enough, kids would play in the project's basketball court, practicing their jump shots under the glow of the moon and a street lamp a few blocks away that cast a little bit of light toward the hoop. The moonlight basketball games, the families crammed together in bathtubs, the popped cars, the popped walls and shattered windows in pyramid courts served as a reminder of just how vulnerable residents were to the white terrorists and the white cops who often joined together to harass and attack them. A former police sergeant recalled his fellow officers as saying, quote, "We're going to go out to pyramid courts, and what we should do is bomb them all out or blow them all up." When they didn't join them, the police left the white men with guns alone to do as they pleased. So how did the nation reach this point? How did this haunting come to be? Black activists in Cairo had long been fighting the conditions of poverty and segregation through nonviolent direct action protests. In the summer of 1962, then 16-year-old Charles Cohen organized black high school students and pyramid court residents into the Cairo Nonviolent Freedom Committee. Under the guidance of field workers from SNCC, including John Lewis, who would go on to speak at the March on Washington the following year, 75 black students held sit-ins at restaurants and formed picket lines. And just like their counterparts down south, these freedom fighters were assaulted, sprayed with fire hoses, and stabbed by white people. But this did not deter the movement. Soon after, the Freedom Committee launched a campaign to desegregate the city's swimming pool, roller rink, youth center, barbershops, and churches through direct action. The Cairo police threw as many of the young protesters in jail as they could, including Cohen and Lewis. So the committee shifted strategies, moving from direct action to civil suits against the swimming pool and the roller rink for denied admission to black patrons, and they won both cases. But rather than open the pools to the black swimmers following the lawsuit, the owners simply closed the facility, boarding up its doors and windows, and eventually filled the pool with concrete, effectively making it a monument to racism in downtown Cairo. The 1962 desegregation campaign did at least succeed in integrating Cairo's restaurants and stores, but black residents remained disproportionately unemployed and underemployed, and they were heavily policed, Police claims that Hunt committed suicide by hanging himself with his t-shirt, but many community members believe the young GI had been murdered by Cairo authorities. That Hunt's bruised body was sent for embalming before dawn only heightened Black skepticism, and the community exploded in anger and despair. After 2 days of firebombing and shooting between Black residents on one side and the police and white vigilantes on the other, Mayor Lee P. Stencil called for a 3-hour meeting with Charles Cohen and 7 other young community leaders in Pyramid Court's administrative building. The young men demanded an end to police brutality. They wanted representation in City Hall, in the fire department, and in the police department. They wanted jobs in Cairo's industries, its banks, its stores, its public utilities, all the places where Black residents were hired only as janitors, if at all. They asked for an overhaul of Pyramid Courts with its crammed, rotting well houses and yards of mud. If the city did nothing, 30-year-old Johnny Brantley cautioned officials, quote, "The next thing you know, Cairo will look like Rome burning down." Chelsea Willis, the sheriff of Alexander County, warned in response, quote, "If that happens, you'll find out how many white extremists there are here." And indeed, after the rebellion, the city's white extremists mobilized. Shortly after the violence subsided, more than 400 white residents gathered at St. Mary's Park in the city's north side. Mayor Stencil also spoke with this crowd. The scene reminded him of the rampaging violence he witnessed at the age of 17 during the 1917 riot in East St. Louis, when white people murdered hundreds of Black residents. East St. Louis labor market had expanded during the First World War, opening up new military production jobs that attracted Black migrants from the South in droves. In cities across the industrial north, white people viewed the newcomers as a threat to their livelihood and turned to violence and intimidation to maintain their political and economic position. In East St. Louis, backed by the state police and local law enforcement, white mobs spent 3 days pulling Black residents from streetcars and beating them. They looted and burned Black homes. It was a prelude to the anti-Black mob violence in some 36 cities during the Red Summer of 1919 and Tulsa in 1921. Stencil told the crowd in Cairo half a century later that he, quote, "saw the slaughter and the destruction firsthand. White people had killed an estimated 200 Black residents during the East St. Louis riot, but perhaps even more disturbing to him was that the violence caused millions of dollars in property damage." The mayor told the crowd, quote, "East St. Louis hasn't amounted to a damn thing since. If it happens here like it happened there, we won't have industry here for 25 years. Stencil indicated that he was sympathetic to his white constituents' concerns, but warned that white supremacist violence had destroyed East St. Louis's future, and that Cairo seemed poised for a similar fate, with its scarcity of jobs for working-class Blacks and whites, and with gatherings such as the one he was witnessing in St. Mary's Park. Stencil explained to the white crowd that he needed time to handle the situation, since, quote, "the Negro problem has been brewing a long time. The transition from segregation to integration involves some growing pains that the good people of Cairo would need to accept." Stencil's emphasis on communication sounded weak to his audience, which wanted assurance that the city's Black residents would be put back in their place. They wanted law and order. For the white people in St. Mary's Park, the solution to Stencil's Negro problem was straightforward. Ignoring the mayor, they formed the Committee of 10 Million. The job of the vigilante group would be to carry out the heavy-handed response the mayor seemed unwilling to deliver. The Committee of 10 Million would protect its members' families, homes, and property from the firebombing and to hold Cairo's rigid color line. Similar groups have been coming together since the end of the Civil Rights Movement, first began to gain momentum in the 1950s. Unlike many of the lynch mobs that have terrorized Black communities from Reconstruction to the middle of the next century, these new white supremacist groups attracted a more genteel class. The founders of the Committee of 10 Million included Peyton Birdling, the wealthy, chain-smoking, white-haired lawyer in his early 70s who had served as district attorney and returned to the post in 1968, and the prosperous lumber dealer Bob Cunningham. Like the Citizens Councils of America that would be formed across the South, the Committee of 10 Million used intimidation and violence to counter the freedom movement, relying not only on brute force, but also on their political and economic power. The committee quickly organized a force of armed white residents Nearly every white person in Cairo who was anybody enthusiastically supported the cause. Soon the vigilantes became known informally as the white hats for the white helmets they wore. And whether this was an intentional nod to the white hoods worn by the Ku Klux Klan is not clear. The white hats believed it was their duty to support the local police, and law enforcement officers, many of whom were also members, embraced the group. Sheriff Willis deputized any white person who wanted to assume police functions, to the point that Cairo businessman Philip D. Marsden famously bragged that he, quote, could get my dog deputized in this town. Marsden and the White Hats' 600 members patrolled the streets of Cairo in groups armed with shotguns, rifles, pistols, two-way radios, and police dogs, conducting paramilitary drills to practice for the impending battle with black residents. Allowed to openly carry weapons like this businessman in the image, hiding out near pyramid courts, and make arrests. The White Hats, as verbally boasted to reporters, could, quote, stop everything that moves in Cairo. If they can't move, they can't fire on. At night, members took part in and amplified ongoing police harassment and intimidation, cruising around Cairo's black neighborhoods and sticking shotguns and rifles out of the windows of their cars at passerby, which were adorned with bumper stickers that read, Cairo, love it or leave it. Under constant threat from the White Hats, black Cairolites waited patiently and peacefully for the city to make good on its promise of police reform and expanded economic opportunities. And although several black patrolmen joined the Cairo Police Department and a neighborhood youth corps program provided jobs to unemployed black youth, conditions changed little over the 2 years since the rebellion of 1967. In fact, the ubiquitous presence of the White Hats on semi-official patrol made the hardship black residents faced feel even more acute, sustaining a climate of fear, violence, and resentment. The grip of the White Hats on Cairo's black community was finally loosened by a young white priest named Father Gerald Montroy, who came to the city in August 1968 to address the alarming rate of black poverty, which was twice the national average. Even more than the crippling poverty, Montroy was disturbed by the White Hats and tried to draw attention to their anti-black violence. Based on an interview with Montroy, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published an article on the organization that appeared on the front page of the March 23, 1969 edition under the headline Vigilante Corps in Cairo. The White Hats were using violence to keep black residents in line, according to Montroy. The blacks in Cairo are afraid of the whites and are terribly repressed by them, he said. Black children required escorts home from school as they walked by. White people would stand on their lawns brandishing shotguns. A White Hats member had recently sicked his German Shepherd on an 11-year-old black girl just to frighten her. As Montroy described the situation, quote, Cairo is a keg of racial dynamite. With the terror of the White Hats newly visible to a wider public, the organization and its local allies went on the offensive. Montroy was an outsider, a troublemaker, who fomented dissension between the races and who had viciously slandered Cairo, riling up black people and getting involved in matters that should be left to local whites. The White Hats, by contrast, were good citizens, as Burley told a Post-Dispatch reporter. The white people who stood on their lawns with their shotguns and their dogs to frighten black children were, quote, protecting their property in an area where Negroes had been throwing stones through windows. As far as Burley and others in Cairo were concerned, vigilantism was a logical response to black rebellion. They saw the White Hats as a good thing, as the conservative pastor at St. Patrick's Church, Hugh Kilfoyle, argued, quote, we can't have militants throwing bombs, he said, even though clearly the White Hats are responsible for most, if not all, the damage in the city, as season it show Black-owned cafe and Black-owned record store, both of which were firebombed in the summer of 1968. So this is how we get to this haunting scene from March 1969, when 8 days after Montroy's accusations made the headlines, members of the White Hats started firing into pyramid courts on the Levy. The purpose of the shooting was to intimidate militant Negroes into submission, and it had the opposite effect. Charles Cohen, local NAACP President Preston Ewing, and other activists who shaped Cairo's freedom struggle in the earlier 1960s, came together to establish a new organization named the Black United Front to fight police brutality, white supremacist violence, and systemic racism. Returning to the tactics used earlier in the decade that partially integrated Cairo, activists called for a citywide black boycott of all stores in the business district where black customers were treated with contempt and where store owners refused to hire black workers. In the words of United Front spokesman, black residents would no longer, quote, provide money for whites to buy bullets to shoot at us. Because they were outnumbered and outgunned by police and white vigilantes, withdrawing from the city's economy was one of the most potent responses black Cairolites could mount. The boycott began on April 7, 1969, with protesters marching through the streets of Cairo and became one of the longest protests in American history. From the spring of 1969 into the early 1970s, picketing was a weekly ritual and determined the basic functioning of the city, and gunfire directed at black residents in pyramid courts from the forces of white hate was a nightly routine. Shortly after the boycott began in April 1969, Illinois Lieutenant Governor Paul Simon visited Cairo for 2 days to see what the shooting was about and what the boycotting was all about. He spoke with mothers, children, and grandfathers in pyramid courts who told him about the white hats and what happened on March 31st, when the vigilantes shot into the housing project for 2.5 hours, setting off Cairo's continuing violence. The white hats, however, made an impressive show of victimhood, ultimately convincing Simon that the group had nothing to do with the attack. While Simon recognized, quote, the white hats of the Committee of 10 Million have become a source of fear for the black community, he ultimately concluded that, quote, this fear appears to be largely unwarranted. This support from authorities and law enforcement only emboldened the white hats. The Saturday after Simon's visit, April 26th, Peyton Berkeley issued warrants for raids on 3 pyramid courts apartments in search of guns and explosives in his capacity as state's attorney. And this was a calculated move. Berkeley timed the searches to coincide with the 3rd Saturday protest in support of the black boycott of white-owned businesses. The police did not discover any weapons in pyramid courts that day. So some protesters returned from the picket line to discover that their homes were ransacked. They were forced to piece together or simply throw away already meager family possessions and left those who dared to challenge the white power structure and their families humiliated. And the raids continued through the 1970s, easily deserving another raid, another firearm raid that happened in 1971. And then Cairo burned. In the 4 days following the raids that Berkeley orchestrated, the city witnessed an unprecedented total of 28 fires, mostly in the Pyramid Courts area, including in the tavern United Front members frequented near St. Columba Church, and in a vacant building that had served as a black high school before integration was enforced in 1967. Intermittent firebombing persisted through May, as did gunshots aimed at the police station, the United Front offices, and Pyramid Courts. Neither side claimed responsibility for the violence. Both sides believed they were acting in self-defense. A Time magazine headline from September 1969 called these events the War in Little Egypt, and others called it something else. The United Front had responded to the conditions of the black community by helping to arm it. As Conway and other United Front members believed, this strategy would serve to correct the mistakes made in the earlier phase of the mainstream civil rights movement. People have learned to defend themselves, Cohen told a reporter from the New York Times. We have to defend ourselves because no law enforcement body would do it. The United Front established an armed unit called the Black Liberators in the spring of 1969, who were trained by Chicago's Deacons for Defense and Justice leader, Fats Crawford, and whose men used survival patrols, as they were called, were formed to keep Cairo's black community safe. If government authorities were unwilling to protect black residents from police brutality and self-defense, a politics that black Americans had adopted historically under white terrorism and government complacency, presented itself as a rational alternative. By mid-June, with no end in sight to the sniping and firebombings absent a major intervention, state authorities moved to shut down the White Hats. The Illinois legislature passed a bill repealing an 1885 state law that permitted the formation of vigilante groups, and under threat of injunction, the White Hats officially disbanded. Yet, within a week, Cairo's right establishment organized another rally in St. Mary's Park with vigilante group resurfaced under a new guise. The United Citizens for Community Action, or UCCA, reported to be focused on, quote, community cooperation, not repression. but the group's informal nickname, the United Racial Expletive that starts with C, Control Organization, suggested otherwise. Most of the White Hats became UCCA members, and more than 1,000 new people joined, bringing the forces of white vigilantism in Cairo to a reported 2,000 people in total. The UCCA also boasted connections well beyond Cairo. In the fall of '69, after meeting with white supremacist leaders in Jackson, Mississippi, the group joined the larger Citizens Council of America movement. In addition to denouncing racist blacks and off-use charges used against black people fighting for equal rights, the UCCA pledged to, quote, find solutions to present problems and set goals for community development by uniting the responsible citizens of Cairo. This was a far more expansive vision than the Protect Your Homes organizing principle of the White Hats. Even though most of the violence in Cairo took place in pyramid courts and was carried out by white people, many white residents felt as if their lives and livelihoods were in jeopardy. A woman who worked at the Mark Twain Cafe, where the UCCA would frequently gather to eat catfish and socialize, shared her customer sentiments. Quote, I'd like to meet him with a machine gun. It's going to end up with a civil war, she told the reporter. The small concessions made by the state toward black residents had given the latter too much power, and the tax-paying, law-abiding, responsible citizens of Cairo, as UCCA described its membership, would fight to defend their rule. Bob Cunningham, the prosperous lumber dealer and founder of the White Hats, who now led the UCCA, shown in this picture, Phil Cohen and other United Front members in front of the UCCA headquarters, announced, quote, we will use every force necessary to put an end to the 5 months of violence the United Front has inflicted on Cairo. So violence, in this sense, is best understood as any action that challenges white supremacy, including nonviolent demonstrations or boycott or armed self-defense. And both of these tactics, of course, were central to the United Front's work. Its politics were rooted in a radical reading of Christianity. The United Front symbol of the pistol overlaid on the Bible brought together the spiritual groundings of the nonviolent legal direct action challenges to discrimination of the civil rights movement with the principles of self-determination, black nationalism, and armed self-defense espoused by the organization's black power contemporaries. As United Front member Clarence Dossier put it, quote, the gun was for your protection and the Bible was for your direction. The organization derived its purpose from the parable of the sheep and the goats in the book of Matthew, in which Jesus calls his followers to, quote, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the needy, administer unto the sick, take in strangers, and visit those in captivity. Along these lines, Cairo's United Front distributed food, clothing, and household goods to impoverished black families, and organized the community on the principles of love and collective self-determination. All of these measures were meant to ensure the survival of black people. Since black residents were boycotting local stores, the Front created a resource distribution network with the Urban League and other sympathetic supporters in the Chicago area who would send tons of canned goods, medical supplies, household items, clothing, and toys down to Cairo. The United Front offered Cairo residents free legal aid services and limited medical care. It established a daycare center, a pig farm, a factory that made prefabricated housing, a women's clothing store, and a grocery store, all based on the principles of collective ownership. Profits were shared with the community in order to distribute wealth equitably. As founder Charles Cohen preached at his organization rally, this work was larger than Cairo. It was part of the broader movement to, quote, replace the white value system, or capitalism, with a system based on cooperation and community. It was clear that the state would not guarantee black residents protection or rights and would not respond to these basic needs. It's up to us, Cohen said. The boycott, of course, was at the center of the United Front's activities during the ongoing conflict in Cairo. In just over a year, 11 white-owned businesses closed as a result of the boycott, sending the town, which was already struggling, into an even deeper depression. The boycott would not have been as successful without the rallies and the picketing, but the United Front believed that direct action fostered solidarity, empowerment, and love in a community under siege. Marching in the streets and seeing downtown stores fold, one after another, allowed every participant to understand their collective power. Together, they were renouncing racism, sacrificing themselves in the process. As United Front spokesman Margaret Harris observed, quote, "The white businessmen are willing to put up with the hardships for their own racism." Each demonstration would begin in St. Columba Church, where Cohen and other activists would speak to the participants, usually about 100 or so in total. And Cohen would say, "We are looking forward to the day we will change society. We will either change society or die, and it will change anyway." When white people first fired their guns into the Pyramid Court's housing project in March '69, as Cohen would remind the group of that clarifying moment, quote, "Something brought us together. It was the will to live, the will to walk around in the open." When the community mobilized against the violent conditions, things changed. Then we really started loving one another, Cohen would say. "We began to understand that if I got shot, you got shot. We began to watch out for one another." Protecting Black Hero meant not only keeping a rifle in the home and meeting people's basic needs for clothing, food, and shelter, but also marshaling collective power and picketing racist businesses. Energized by the rally, the pickets would march downtown, where groups of white residents awaited, staying on sidewalks and leaning on storefronts. State and local police would array themselves at the intersections, blocking traffic to allow the march. A patrol car would follow the marchers, who would be surrounded by hostile white residents and further police. This municipal employee in this picture I thought was captured giving demonstrators a finger as they passed by. And yet, despite all this, they marched every week. They would march as UCCA leader Carl Haupt blasted awful noise to demonstrators from a loudspeaker he installed at his Cairo music company. He would put on a laugh track. Just imagine that when you're protesting, a laugh track, blasting in your ears. Or excerpts from speeches from former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Bob Cunningham might follow the marches, taking pictures and recording anything that participants said, as these images show. And then the 3-mile march would end back at St. Columba Church, where protesters would clap their hands and stomp their feet in the pews. Most of the people at the rallies and in the streets were young, but a few older people could be found. And it was more likely than not that shots would be fired into Pyramid Courts that night, perhaps from the same white men who sneered as the pickets drove by. Many of the adult activists who marched during the day kept their guns close at night. If the shooting was sustained or became truly dangerous, "We will fire back," as Margaret Harris said during an interview. "We are not playing," he said. The white ruling elite of Cairo weren't playing either. Quote, "If we have to kill them, we'll have to kill them," Cairo Mayor Peter Thomas said in the ABC News segment that aired in November 1970 after 20 months of warfare. "It seems to me that this is the only way we're going to solve our problems." Thomas's comment was extreme, even by Cairo standards, but government authorities and the police had long been complicit in violence against people of color. In both North and South throughout the 20th century, from East St. Louis in 1917 to Cairo in 1970, white vigilantes killed Black Americans and bombed Black homes, businesses, and institutions. They faced little, if any, consequence for their actions because this violence was an accepted way of preserving public safety, meaning reinforcing white dominion when Black people won political and economic gains. As the boycott wore on, Cairo's United Front increasingly focused its energies on economic development. Beginning in 1971, operating through the Egyptian Housing Corporation, the United Front provided homes and jobs for low-income families, Black and white, as the city clearly would not. Even though the corporation tried to help all Cairaites, the white ruling elite resisted its efforts. The city council denied the corporation's bids on vacant land owned by the city in 1971 and 1972, essentially trapping Black residents in shacks or under the gunfire in the otherwise more desirable Pyramid Courts. Any changes in Cairo after its war would have to be made by Black residents and their allies. The Egyptian corporation went around city authorities, acquiring land on which it built homes with seed money from the Illinois Housing Development Authority. Soon enough, Cairo residents could own homes for $65 to $85 a month with no down payment. By 1980, the corporation had constructed about 200 houses and created hundreds of jobs in the process. United Front members also secured jobs for Black residents through the Pyramid Courts Tenants Council, which received subcontracts from both the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Alexander County to build new roofs and make other improvements to the existing housing project. The Tenants Council worked with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, filing a class action lawsuit that eventually led to the desegregation of public housing in Cairo. The Lawyers Committee, a team of white liberal attorneys who arrived in Cairo in September 1969, proved to be a critical line of defense against racial repression in the city. Over the following decade, the Lawyers Committee successfully challenged unconstitutional ordinances, including one that prohibited gatherings of more than 2 people, in federal district court, contested disciplinary decisions handed down by Cairo school administrators, and provided assistance to residents who had been arrested or abused. By 1974, 30 black families lived in the previously all-white Elmwood Place, and 5 white families had moved into Pyramid Courts. The shootings from the nearby Levy, the junkyard, and the police department's armored vehicle had ended. The Lawyers Committee's final case in 1980 effectively secured black representation on the city council for the first time in Cairo's history, offering a new degree of political power to black people, even as the city fell deeper into economic depression. The committee's suit challenged the at-large city council elections that prevented black residents, who again made up just under half of the city's population, from electing their preferred candidates. And Charles Cohen was elected to the council in 1983, which with his arrival had 3 black and 4 white representatives. Although they were no longer fighting with their fists in the streets or exchanging gunfire, Cohen consistently sparred in the council chambers with Mayor Alan Moss, a former white hat and prominent member of the UCCA. Here's an image of future Mayor Moss confronting a protester in the early 70s. Moss won the mayor's race in 1976 and held it for 15 years. Cohen told a reporter in 1985 of Moss's strategy, quote, "It seems crazy to think that just because the mayor hates me, he's going to let the whole town dry up." As Cohen saw it, Moss, quotes, perceives his role as trying to keep what they have, and the way to do that is to do nothing. Cohen understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the sustained violence against black people in Cairo in the past decade led to the slow death of a city consumed by its own racism, and everyone lost. On top here is Commercial Avenue in Cairo at the height of the city's prosperity in 1929, and Commercial Avenue today. Unemployment in Cairo consistently topped 20% through the end of the 1980s, with black residents still unemployed at a rate 3 times that of their white counterparts. 1/3 of Cairo residents live below the poverty line. An adult vocational school was still open and training welfare recipients for non-existent jobs as oil rig operators and furniture upholsterers. The roller rink Cohen and others had fought to desegregate with John Lewis and other snake activists in the early 1960s closed, as did the disco and the movie theater. The United Front's 3-year boycott that had led by the early 70s to the closure of 17 discriminatory white-owned businesses downtown, about 1/3 of the city's stores, and then nothing replaced them. The city bid for one of 2 new state prisons in the late 1970s, a $25 million prison construction project that would have created 400 jobs, but Cairo was passed over due to its economic instability and declining population. By the mid-1980s, its hospital closed due to lack of funds. Cairo began to gain a reputation as a ghost town. As Jerry Gibson, the white owner of a business that was one of the few left standing in the downtown district, reflected, quote, "I don't think Cairo's ever coming back. There's so much hate here. There's always so much hate in Cairo." The decision by local authorities to respond to egalitarian demands by shoring up white supremacy, decisions exacerbated by state and federal inaction, killed the city in the end. "It's no longer blacks against whites in Cairo," said Mayor Moss, the former active white supremacist in 1987. "It's Cairo against the world." Today, Cairo has just over 2,000 remaining residents, and 2/3 of them are black. White people escaped in the decades after the war in the city, while black residents on the whole still live with the violent legacies of American racism and of the paths not chosen. What happened in Cairo across this era is both exceptional in its violence, while at the same time broadly representative of the violence of American racism. I see the history of Cairo as a parable, a warning, showing us that racism is bad for everyone, not just for people of color. Racism kills, literally and figuratively. It has eroded our democracy, and it continues to threaten our democracy. It prevents this nation from living up to its enlightened founding principles of freedom, justice, and equality. But Cairo's history also offers us hope and a path forward. Like their forebears in the 1960s and early 1970s, Black Liberators marched through the streets calling for an end to racism and discrimination in the summer of 2020. Charles Cohen died in 2018, and now his daughter, Robbie Cohen, delivered the main address in her father's honor at the Heartland Unity March and Juneteenth celebration that took place in the streets of downtown Cairo on June 19, 2020. In a nod to the city's history and her father's own contribution to it, Robbie Cohen saw herself as, quote, standing on the shoulders of the one who fought the good fight here in Cairo. The question I ask you today is, what are you going to do? And the question I ask myself is, what am I going to do? We have a responsibility as Black people to stand up for what is true. We can't move forward, right, unless we reckon with the past and learn from it to create a better future. And maybe learn from the United Front to continue our struggle, no matter what the obstacles are. All right, I've been talking way too much, but before I open it up to questions, I just want to acknowledge some of the works that helped me make sense of Cairo's story more than any other. Many of the images that I used in this talk came from Robert Sutherland, who helped put together the pamphlet on the battlefield and was generous enough to grant me permission to use images from the On the Battlefield pamphlet in America on Fire. And in this presentation in particular, I drew heavily from Preston Ewing Jr.'s Other People Go, a powerful book with many fantastic images of Cairo during this period. And finally, Carrie Pinblock's book, Faith in Black Power, has been indispensable for me in terms of understanding Cairo's story. And if you're interested in learning more and a much more comprehensive account than I was able to offer today and in America on Fire, I highly recommend that you read Professor Pinblock's work. And with that, I thank you very much for coming and for listening to my work. Happy to take questions, comments. I know it's, it's a lot heading into it right now. Yes.
Is there any continuing presence from the UA on the efforts that, build through community to get that kind of die out somewhere along the line?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the status of the movement is today. I mean, it's clear that there is, that the struggle is continuing through some of the work that Robbie is doing. From what I understand, there's an ongoing effort to continue to get resources to Cairo to address the ongoing housing problems. Now pyramid courts in Elmwood Place have been demolished, and the housing issue has been and remains a really, really pressing one. There simply isn't enough housing, and there aren't enough jobs. And so I think part of it is trying to address people's basic needs in the style of the United Front, and mobilizing to get the resources to do so. But there's not, from what I understand, the kind of the climate in Cairo during this period, and the impact of segregation and violence there mobilized the community, and then the mobilization on both sides kind of grew. And the conditions since then have changed. Yeah.
What struck you about this particular town? How did you find out about it? Why did you start studying it?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. If I had more time to talk, I would have gotten into it a little bit more. So, America on Fire is based on this archive from the University Center for the Study of Violence that was operating out of Brandeis University shortly after John F. Kennedy was assassinated to document conflict in American society. And essentially, it was like a news clipping service where these researchers, scoured local newspapers for anything, from rebellion, black rebellion, to student protests, to war movement, labor strike, that we put in this archive. A lot of the archive is not public, it's kind of been just passed around by these political scientists, and I happen to be able to know the right person and got access to it. And Cairo appeared in the archive, was very represented in the archive because the violence there lasted so long. But the story in the archive was, the story that, for the most part, was the story that UCCA and White Hats never sold, which is, the headlines are like, police station hit by black snipers, or, like black revolutionaries are, assaulting white civilians. It was this, that the United Front was attacking white institutions, and I said, this is really, what's going on in this city? This is interesting. This is not quite what I'm seeing in the other cities. And then when I started digging deeper, I realized that there was this whole other story there that was much deeper, and that in some ways was so reflective of, I think, hasn't been recognized enough, the kind of trajectory of the turn in violence in the late 60s, where, in nearly every city where this kind of rebellion or violence occurred, people had been doing nonviolent direct action, just as they had in Cairo, and they weren't getting results, and the conditions were still the same, and so they switched to self-defense, and the taxes switched to self-defense. And so, as I read more, I just became, and that's why I kept on saying talk, just really haunted by what happened, and really haunted by the way that the again, exceptional, but also in some ways representative way that white supremacist violence and police violence were so intertwined there. And what I was reading, I have to keep on reminding myself that this was occurring in the 1970s, right? Like German shepherds getting sick on kids. If you think about Mississippi in like the 1940s, you don't think about that happening into the 1970s. So even as a historian of the Black freedom movement and racial inequality, I was surprised and haunted by what had happened here. And that I'm certainly not the first person to tell the story, nor will I be the last, but that more people aren't aware of the story and thought about it in terms of what does this teach us about how racism works. And that is, I think it really shows, as they ended on that, that it's just bad for everyone. It doesn't benefit anyone. So, I'll answer your question. Yeah.
Thanks, Doctor. So, I apologize in advance for the answer. This is in the book. I saw that's good. It's in how many grade levels. But I was curious if you knew anything about the relationship between, you mentioned like the local-ish and the WSIU chapter, and then we talked about, self-defense between that. Did they maintain a good relationship, or did they, because I was thinking like Robert Williams and Monroe, North Carolina, he was a local chapter president, but once he became kind of like disgruntled with working and the legal system around like cool, some yours, not even bad, he didn't want segregation, or desegregation, he wanted local. Then he started advocating for our self-defense, and he was kind of excised from that. And there's a history, of course, and the LACP decided certain folks are desirable, ideological. So do you know if they stayed working together, or?
So that's a really, really great question. So I think there's a couple things going on here. I think that, one, when Robert F. Williams was advocating on self-defense, that was in the 50s and early 60s. That was in a different, the movement was in a different phase. I think one of the things that this archive really hammered home to me was how much, and I kind of mentioned this as an aside when we talk, but by the late 60s, really after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, after the federal government, I didn't talk about this very much in the talk, but after the federal government really begins to invest in expanding and militarizing local police forces as part of this unprecedented war on crime. The federal government, until 1965, had never, granted money to local police departments, and now local police departments are getting these big grants, they're getting all these weapons from Vietnam, and for that, Cullen's generation, and the younger generations who had watched the civil rights movement unfold, and were hopeful, and who at the end of the 60s, still weren't getting the changes that they wanted and the proponent of nonviolence have been assassinated. And so there's a real shift in the movement towards the politics of self-determination and Black power, but also self-defense, because people were tired of it. We saw it in the 60s in Cairo, beaten horribly by police and white civilians, and by the end of the decade, it's like, well, we're going to defend ourselves at this point. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is that WSIU, who was the NAACP, who's head of the local NAACP in Cohen, was United Front was really, out of just like how marginalized Black characters were in the city. I think the strategy was we've got to get together to provide food for our people and to keep ourselves safe from this shooting that's going on. So, I think if you look at the local level, it was about, coalition building, and really, we know in social movements that maintaining these types of coalitions, especially under conditions like Black characters we're living in, are really essential. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, thank you.
Comment first. Thank
Yeah,
you.
please.
Thank you for coming. Hearing this coming from you is both comforting and inspirational. It's not easy. I'm a grad student here. It's not easy, and you make it better. So thank you. Secondly, the question. I see a parallel, and you alluded to it, parallel in what is happening in America to what happened in Cairo. And while I will admit the caveat that maybe Cairo's story is not over yet, it ain't looking good, you said that there's hope, and I don't see it. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so, yeah.
I don't mean for Cairo, I mean for this country.
Pardon?
I don't mean just for Cairo, I mean for this country.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, it's a tough one. First, let me say thank you for your comment. That really means a lot to me. It means a lot to me. And I guess, in some ways, that comment also gives me hope. I mean, I think the past few years have been really tough. I didn't mention in the talk at all January 6th or, the kind of, again, you see the same pattern, right? Like, there's a mobilization for racial justice, an unprecedented mobilization that happens in 2020, and then with that comes the mobilization of white supremacist forces. It's the same thing that we saw playing out in Cairo again, how it's this kind of metaphor or parable for American society. And, I have to, I guess as a historian, and I try to remain optimistic. I have to remain optimistic because it's part of what keeps me going. I mean, I think about Cohen as kind of what I was getting at the end, through all these struggles, they kept organizing, kept mobilizing, and did what they could to help the people survive. It didn't necessarily change the outcome of Cairo, right? But I have to hope that as we keep doing this work and as we're having these conversations, and there's a time when, me talking about this stuff, me writing a book that's trying to redefine value as rebellion, wouldn't have happened. The conversations that we're having about systemic racism, the fact that systemic racism has become a buzzword, the fact that we're, there's this attack on critical race theory, which essentially means the history of exploitation and oppression in the United States. People don't want to talk about that. But at the same time, I feel like we know more about that history than we ever had before. And I think hopefully, these things will lead us to finally living up to, again, as I end
1972. My father's family survived the East St. Louis race riot, but my mother and father were denied entrance into the Roman Catholic Church in Cairo because the priest down there in 1936 said, they'll run me out of town if I bring you into the Catholic Church. But to see them meeting at St. Columbus, the same way the Black Panthers met in the Catholic Church basements in Chicago, Preston Ewing, we started signing leave because we know his family. And I've been in Cairo a number of times because I was also, in your story, the founding chair of the 1917 East St. Louis Centennial Commission. And as I told you over there, we got here. You and my department. But I want you to know, answering Jeremy's question, you brought me hope. He brings me hope. This one brings me hope. And the anthropology students bring me hope. Because at my age, to see so much of my story being brought here by you tells me that they lived correctly, my mother and father. Because even though they were told we can't make you Catholic, I wouldn't be a Catholic priest for 50 years if they hadn't said, well, whatever you say, it ain't gonna work. And to have been put at the bottom of the table so often at Senator Simon's house, not that Perry and I were ever told to be quiet and act like we
representative who will be representing Cairo if he wins his African American. I asked him to be here tonight, but the NAACP had a candidate forum tonight, so we had to go to that first. But I'm on little steps, but a lot of little steps. And I lived in Cairo. I graduated from Cairo High School in 1968. So I lived there during a lot of this. I was there until 1969. It was in 67 when they desegregated the school systems,
Yeah.
which is a subject for a whole nother.
In Camelot, I know, I couldn't even get into that whole thing.
Yeah, because basically they shut the black schools down and sent the kids over to the white schools. They lost all identity from where they had been.
Well, thank you for sharing that, thank you for coming. All right, well, this was an incredible experience. I've been trying to get John to bring me back, so hopefully this will not be, hopefully I will be able to be with all of you again soon, and I really appreciate everyone for coming. It really, and everybody's comments have really gotten so much out of this experience, and thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. She had a very long trip to come here off the same flew from the East Coast to the Twin Cities, to St. Louis, and then drove here. So we really appreciate the long trip and just the thoughtfulness of her remarks. I really would recommend reading the book of Marathon Fire. It's really riveting, not only about Cairo, but Peoria, where I grew up. There's some amazing chapters and passages about that. So we will have her back, I promise that. And thank you